and welcome to Follow the White Rabbit, where we go down the rabbit hole to explore the intersection of privacy, human rights, technology, and democracy. I'm your host, Alex Kahaya, and today we are speaking with two guests, Ken Seiff, who is an entrepreneur and venture capitalist. He's built several successful companies, including Bluefly and Poppin, and is currently focused on investing in early stage companies, blockchain companies, protocols, and applications that are trying to make a dent in the universe. Our other guest is the one and only Dr. Stephen Waterhouse, aka Seven, who you all know is the co-founder and CEO of Orchid Labs, and previously was a partner at Pantera, where he was an early investor in many notable blockchain projects. Before that, he was the co-founder and CTO of RPX, which he started in the middle of a recession, which I thought was pretty interesting because they eventually took that company public. I'm stoked to have you both on the show today, and thanks for being here.
Thanks, Alex. Good to be here.
Yeah, Ken, I'd like to start with you. Can you just tell us a little bit more about your background and what brought you to the Web3 space?
Yeah, sure. I'm a recovering founder. As you mentioned, I started a couple of companies, and there's a few more littered along the trail there. And at one point, I went to go do a startup post Poppin, and went to a VC who looked at me and said, "We don't do early stage, but our money would like to eventually get into that space." And within days, we had decided to form a early stage VC together called Beanstalk Ventures. I was very, very early on in that startup, and I had sort of figured that I would do one more startup and then get into the VC game anyway. And that led to making a series of investments at the intersection of retail and technology. Along the way, I saw an occasional deal that was not retail related. Bitcoin was one of them in 2011, 2012, and then Ethereum in 2014. And when I made the Ethereum investment in 2014, I had no idea what was going to come of it. So by the time I was ready to start my third fund in the retail tech world, Ethereum had really taken root, and it was early 2017. And I decided rather than start a third retail tech fund, I would go into the blockchain. I had at that point made investments in Bitcoin, in Ethereum, and a little company called Parity, which was Gav Wood's startup after Ethereum, which is now recently launched Polkadot.
And how did you and Seven meet? Just out of curiosity, I know we kind of mentioned that a little bit before we started recording the show.
In early 2018, we were both in Berlin at the Blockstack annual summit, and we met. We were both speaking there. We met in the speaker room, and the next thing I know, I was writing Seven a check.
Thanks for the support.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, really I asked the question by Alex before the call, and I was like, I can't remember because it feels like forever ago, but I guess it's only a couple of years. So this was
yeah, no, I have a really bad memory, but I remember meeting Seven. We had I think communicated a couple times by email. We met in the speaker room. We chatted very briefly, and then we had a couple more short conversations. And then Seven was in New York, and we had dinner, and that led to a partnership.
Yeah, I remember New York very well.
Yeah,
Berlin was a bit of a blur.
Yeah.
So this one thing that I loved about the blockchain venture funds sort of pitch, the tagline, looking for companies that are making a dent in the universe. That's something that resonates with me, and I think something that probably resonates with you as well, Seven. Given what we're trying to do at Orchid, I think that that definitely qualifies as trying to make a dent in the universe. This is kind of a question for both of you guys, but what projects are we seeing in our space, and maybe even outside the space, that we think could make that dent, and what is that dent? Like, what is the change that might happen? What's coming?
I think the quote comes from Steve Jobs originally, and I think it's like something around, when you poke the universe pokes back. And I guess from my perspective, building Orchid over the last few years, we started off with a lot of people saying, almost kind of even rejecting the idea that privacy was going to be an issue. and that people are going to be as concerned about it as they are now. And it's one of those things that you don't want to be a Cassandra and be right about bad things, but it's definitely become much more of an issue for people. In the last few years, we've had governments in both directions, both increasing surveillance and censorship, and even in the wake of what's happening with COVID, it's becoming a bigger deal and more on people's minds. And then also things like GDPR and CCPA in California becoming initiatives that people are saying, how do I take back my privacy? Yeah, so I mean, I guess I'm fairly laser focused on this issue and this space. So I tend to be focused a lot on companies and initiatives that are looking at that.
And if that were a burgeoning industry before COVID and before this civil unrest, privacy just got pulled forward, and the need for privacy just got pulled forward by years as a result of both COVID-19 and the civil unrest. And specifically what I mean by that is when you look at the impact of something like 9/11, we saw human rights and privacy in particular, privacy as well, be castrated by government, new government laws, acts, and institutions. And you saw the TSA grow up. It was the fastest, I think it was the largest government startup in history. You had the Patriot Act. You had the combination of Immigration and Naturalization Service and the Customs, the Customs Department into ICE. And so you saw these really significant transformations take place in government that reduced our rights as a civilization, or at least as an American civilization. The same is likely going to happen now as a result of the pandemic. And we're seeing things like the discussion of health passports as an example. We saw the breakdown of, slightly differently, we saw the breakdown of our systems to distribute capital. So while blockchain is being talked about as a solution in both those cases for both the distribution of future government handouts and the ability to monitor our citizens through health passports and even tracking apps, I think it's likely that there's going to be some government intervention that tramples on our rights to privacy as a result of this particular event. And then you layer in what's happening in the world around us with the civil unrest and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think it is also likely that the infrastructure to track people and protesters and looting through the cameras in the streets is going to lead to some much more aggressive tracking systems that stitch together all those cameras in a way that the government can track who's there. I think arguably the best thing to happen to privacy as a result of COVID is the masks. I think it's going to make it a lot harder to track people with masks on than not with masks on. It's just a byproduct.
Yeah, Face ID doesn't work when using a mask, right?
Yeah.
Makes it harder for sure.
I definitely agree with that. I think that the last few months, the combination of the two things, especially in the US, of COVID, the lockdowns, emergence of contact tracing applications, and then the Black Lives Matter movement. There's an interesting conversation I was having the other day, which was talking about if you thought people were scared about installing an app that was going to be tracking them before, imagine how concerned they're going to be to install an app that's going to be tracking them now, given the increasing concerns of authoritarian regimes. And just to kind of again go back to actually over 3 years ago, one of the narratives that was running through my mind before we started Orchid was kind of a dinner party conversation I used to have, and I'd be on one of these dinner party guests where people would roll me out and say, hey, talk about surveillance and privacy again. And I used to give this example, and this was before the 2016 election. And I was like, imagine if this country elects somebody and then something happens, whether it's a terrorist attack or I guess in this case, protests and a raging epidemic, and the next thing we have martial law. And if you've got the existing technology for messaging and internet access and publishing, you really don't have a way to kind of get out of that. And you don't have to go that far. You just go to China and you see that WeChat is the only messaging framework that you can use. And most of the internet is blocked off. And so you are in a situation where it's incredibly difficult to organize yourself to even just peacefully protest or anything else, to basically be a counter force to a government that's maybe being incredibly oppressive.
And imagine a government that is being oppressive secretly, and you have protests, and you know who the police are and what their phones are. It would not be a big leap of imagination for them to simply be able to track 100% of the people at a protest by their GPS signals.
Crazy.
The new world we live in with these devices, I think got put on a pedestal recently in the Money Heist series, which I just binge watched.
Oh, nice.
And without giving away the scene, there is an episode using some old phones that don't have GPS tracking on them, and it brought to mind, as I watched it, how incredibly far we've come as a society, but also how much more exposed we are simply as the result of having a GPS device in our phones.
Yeah, and I mean the scale of the surveillance too. Seven, you brought up the China example in WeChat. I was just reading the little Bitcoin book that Alexander Lloyd and a bunch of other folks put together. I don't know if you've seen that.
Yeah.
There's some great examples in there of the level of automation that the Chinese government has built into the surveillance is, I mean, a few years ago probably you wouldn't have believed that it would exist. I mean, you send a message with the wrong thing in it and people show up. It's like Minority Report, right? Like they show up at your door and take you away for some re-education, and you can imagine that it's not that far of a leap for that to happen kind of anywhere with the right circumstances. Or what you were saying about the dinner party conversation all of a sudden becomes a lot closer to reality in a matter of months.
Yeah, and you just go back to the beginning of COVID in Wuhan, and the first doctors who discovered that and tried to get the message out through WeChat groups ended up getting detained, forced to recant it publicly, and then ultimately one of them subsequently died from COVID, and there was attempts to celebrate him as a whistleblower, but that also got censored. So this is, in our current situation, imagine if that information had been able to get out more quickly, maybe a month earlier than it did, what difference that would have made to the entire world.
Yeah, and we're watching that happen around the world. Brazil is censoring the data around COVID deaths as well. I mean, this is not a China problem. This is a global problem today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So and again, this is for both of you. We have a lot of interesting projects in the space. You mentioned Polkadot as one of them, Parity, and I think, Seven, you alluded to the need for a lot of different solutions to break into that Web3 environment, so that you can get away from these more centralized environments where where the government can, surveil you, or where these scalable censorship and surveillance can happen. What are the projects in the space that are building tools that could be successful, that, obviously other than Orchid, that you're seeing that could help solve this problem for the average person?
Within the space, I think I'm still a big fan of Zcash, which I was an early investor in, and the technologies that's coming out of Starkware, which is a group in Israel, who are the scientists that were also co-founders in the Zcash project. So I think that kind of work around zero knowledge proofs is going to be fundamental to a future wave of decentralized, private layer 1 technologies and layer 2 technologies. So I think that is really on a science level. That's the project I'm most focused on. I'm interested in what they're doing now.
And Orchid as well.
Oh.
What about you, Ken?
I think what intrigues me about this is both the inherent conflict between privacy and anonymity, and then also the public side of the blockchain. So while Bitcoin is inherently anonymous, it's not private. Every transaction is visible for everyone to see. And a good enough data scientist can begin to link wallets together and identify people. And then with a little more information, and I would imagine you guys would be way more expert at this than I am, you can link a payment to a website where something's delivered, and now you can identify the person, all their wallets, and begin to assemble their transaction history. And that's exactly what's going on. And so I think the smarter the blockchain companies become about privacy, the smarter the workaround solutions are. And I think there's going to be this laddering up of privacy and then privacy breaking solutions that we're going to see for generations to come. This problem doesn't get solved by the blockchain.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the counterpoint to that, and the sort of the segue from that, is also that we are now, for the first time, seeing companies such as ourselves and other people who are funded to develop anti-censorship, anti-surveillance, privacy-focused technologies, and that's kind of a big deal. I mean, if you rewound 6 years ago, 5 years ago, and to say, hey, I'm going to start a company that's just focused on developing privacy technology, the question is, well, what's the market? Why would you care about this? Who really cares? What's the business model? But building blockchain technologies, building cryptocurrency focused companies that have these angles, and increasingly we're seeing consumers and businesses calling for them. I think that's a positive development. And I can only hope that the combination of different companies and different technologies will improve. And if we are in an arms race of privacy versus surveillance and censorship, at least we're in the arms race versus just having no kind of dog in the fight. And it's just, the Great Firewall of China, which is a collection of technologies, I think is estimated to have cost about $1 billion to build. That's a pretty steep wall to climb up for all of the companies at this point. So at least we're kind of in the fight now.
Yeah, except, it gives you this complacency to know that great firewall exists, right? Or that some currently private blockchain technology works, and then everything gets spilled into that, more data than ever in history, and then the quantum computer comes around and breaks it, for example. Right? So now you're in this position where even more information is exposed than ever before. And it's an analog to digital race at the same time, because there's no question that we're going to have digital currencies likely that are a public record. So who's spending it in, and who's spending it specifically may be private, but where it's being spent could become public. And if that takes place, which I anticipate it will, and then there's some breakage in that, way more information than in history has ever been available will be exposed. These are perhaps black swan events that we almost can't predict.
Yeah, and I think that the thought I had as you were talking there is it's not just who's spending what, where, with whom. It's also what's effectively the social graph of that money movement afterwards. Is that exposes a lot of information about someone's connections, someone's other business arrangements, and so on, and it just becomes this permanent record of everything that you do, which I agree is very concerning. And we see this in a lot of central bank initiatives, China and even the US now and in Europe, trying to put into place these digital currencies, which are the one thing I'm concerned about in the blockchain space is the idea that the technology is the answer, and it's not. The technology can be used in lots of different ways, and it really depends on the initiatives that different people are putting in place and how they're using it.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. Question that popped up in my head while we were having while you guys were talking just now is, do you have to have privacy and surveillance resistance in one of these platforms, or in order to have censorship resistance, or can you just have censorship resistance by itself? The reason I ask that is because in the past 2 days we've seen Zoom come out or some bad press come out for Zoom regarding the censorship of some activists that were celebrating or mourning the Tiananmen Square, remembering the Tiananmen Square incident in China. So they got removed, their accounts got removed from Zoom. And then another app called, what was it called? Hold on. Pocket Casts, which is a pretty big podcasting app in China that got removed from the Apple App Store because they were not censoring. They were refusing to censor any of the podcasts on the show. So when I think about these technologies, I just wonder, can we build these two technologies? They're meant to broadcast stuff. They're not meant for privacy or surveillance resistance, but they are getting censored and blocked. And so can you have one without the other? Are there actually going to be applications that replace Zoom and Pocket Caster that are built on decentralized compute platforms? And these are the things that start to go through my head as we have that conversation.
I think that these what I noticed in the period of time I've been in cryptocurrency and blockchain, and even before, when you think of something like the emergence of Twitter during the Arab Spring, which is when it really took off, is that when people ask what's the use case for, say, a decentralized version of Zoom or a decentralized version of a podcasting app, they're like, well, what's the real difference, and do people care, and so on. And then you get a black swan event like Ken is talking about, or a situation where people are just trying to get the word out and trying to communicate in a different way, and then all of a sudden the inherent weaknesses in the centralized technologies become apparent. And I think that's probably what's going to happen, is we will see the emergence of these kinds of platforms, and then there'll be some event where people suddenly start using it as an alternative to the centralized approaches, and people suddenly understand, and maybe it's still a minority group, but that's how things start.
Yeah, and again, once they start, the flywheel's going, it's really hard to stop. It's one of the levers which led us to investing in Orchid. We believe that's going to happen. We believe it's already happening. It's just a question of how fast. The second thing that I would just point out here is there is a need for this in second and third world countries that we can't fathom being Americans. And living in this country, our systems are pretty good. Our rights are pretty good. We are not collared by the government. And so I think if you want to try to understand the power of protecting the privacy of a citizen, the power of accessing information, you have to take yourself out of this world and just imagine it launching somewhere else first, because it's not going to, US is not going to be the first place this springs forth from.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So I want to go back to Polkadot for a minute. Help me understand. Honestly, I've done some research on that technology, that company, but help me. Maybe both of you guys can educate me and the people listening on what Polkadot is and why it matters.
Yeah, sure. Gav Wood, who started Polkadot, is a general partner in our venture fund. I met Gav when he was working on the yellow paper for Ethereum in early 2014. And he's an extraordinary technologist and a really deep thinker. And when he left Ethereum to become the founder of Parity, he had a vision which I thought was sort of next generation Ethereum at the time, but for large enterprise companies. And as he began to build that out, what I think he came to the conclusion, and I don't want to speak for him, but I think when he was at Parity in the early days, he came to the conclusion that large enterprises aren't just going to need admin control and better scalability and a series of features that Ethereum didn't have, but that they were all going to try to solve this problem simultaneously, and lots of companies were going to try to solve it simultaneously. And that instead of having a single public blockchain, you would end up with multiple public blockchains, multiple private blockchains, and none of them would talk to each other. So that was really different than the evolution of the internet. And yet, while the blockchain and the internet have extraordinary amount of similarities, this is one of the big differences. When the internet was developed, it was developed by educational and government institutions. They didn't try to build the most perfect internet. They tried to collaborate to build a good internet. And so when they were done building it, they had a single internet upon which every application was built. The blockchain, in part because of cryptocurrencies, allowed individuals to own pieces of the core IP, of the layer one protocols. And that meant, after the success of Bitcoin, where you see hundreds of billions of dollars of market cap, it meant that small investors could make a lot of money. And so that created an economic incentive in these layer one protocols for people to become trillionaires. And the result was, why build something that's just good enough and we can all settle on one standard when I can build my own layer one, and I can become a trillionaire. And if I suck at it, maybe I can become a billionaire. And she had this arms race to build layer one protocols and then some layer two protocols, where the economic incentive was so powerful that I think with certainty we will not end up with one blockchain, with one layer one protocol. Now, imagine if that same situation had taken place in the internet and multiple people built multiple internets, and PayPal built their business on internet number one, and eBay built their business on internet number two, and they just simply didn't talk to each other like different computer languages. I don't think either of those companies would have realized their potential without each other. And that's exactly the state that we have right now in the blockchain. There are thousands of protocols. They don't talk to each other, and companies building on one can't transact value or data to the other one. And so that limits the outcome of every single company on every single blockchain. What Polkadot and Cosmos and a handful of companies have tried to do is build an interoperability protocol that allows one blockchain to talk to another blockchain, to transact with those blockchains. This is one of the few global network effect businesses that we've seen in the blockchain. Consequently, it's our largest investment as a fund. It is probably one of our one or two highest conviction investments, because there can really only be one winner. And in many other places, even layer one protocols themselves, we think even if there's a big winner in the US and Europe, there's probably a different winner in China. There may be a different winner in South Korea. There may be a different winner in Latin America. Here, when you're connecting all of those disparate chains, the network effects is increasingly powerful as more and more people get involved across multiple geographies. And that's a relatively unique circumstance. It's like the difference between Uber and Airbnb. With Uber, it's a local monopoly. If I ride in New York City, I'm much more likely to take Uber each time I go. But if I go to a different city, it's very infrequent. And I don't necessarily have to ride Uber when Uber, at least in the early days of Uber. They had to win each city one at a time. Whereas when I travel globally. And so if Airbnb gets me in one city and they're not in the other cities I go to, I eventually lose interest in Airbnb. I don't want a different Airbnb in each city. And so while they both are global companies, the natural monopoly of Airbnb is global in scale, and the natural monopoly of an Uber is most likely local or maybe regional. Polkadot, I think, is one of the few blockchain companies that I can think of that are global monopolies naturally. And I should say interoperability, because we have come to the conclusion that it's likely to be Polkadot that wins. There are other very smart investors who think it might be Cosmos. I haven't seen anybody else make a credible challenge yet, but there could be more coming.
What do you think, Stephen?
Yes, I'm actually an advisor at Web3 Foundation, also. I know Gav from the early days, and yeah, this idea of cross-chain compatibility has been around for even before Ethereum, and we're kind of looking at a lot in the early days of Bitcoin as to could we build side chains and these kind of technologies. So definitely familiar with the vision of it, and definitely echo a lot of what Ken is saying. And I think that as you start thinking about not just companies, but also governments and interoperability between national currencies and chains that are built in different ways, the picture becomes even larger. Certainly one of the sort of segues to this is one of the things we've been looking at Orchid, and I think anybody who's got applications or layer 2 built on whatever chain you have, especially Ethereum, is what is the next generation of blockchains for smart contracts. Ethereum has a published transition plan that is going to be moving to an Ethereum 2. And I think something like Polkadot continues to be relevant, or is even more relevant then, because you're going to have some stuff that just stays on Ethereum 1 and some stuff that is going to move to Ethereum 2. I don't think Ethereum 1 is just going to stop being a thing. I imagine we'll probably get a fork of 1 versus 2. And then Polkadot has their own main parachain, as they're called. The chains are called parachains. So that could be a competitor to what is next, Ethereum 2. We've got all sorts of other smart contract competitors out there looking at trying to solve a number of different things. We're very focused on what is the next layer 1 design or combination of layer 1 and layer 2 that adds in a number of the features we've been looking at. We've solved for our own purposes scalability on Ethereum using what we call probabilistic nanopayments. And so we're able to do data networking speeds with blockchain payments. But still, there are aspects of privacy and anonymity we'd like to see built in. I think Polkadot has a number of capabilities there that we've actually been exploring to see what we can do with that platform.
And just for everybody listening on the payment side of things for Orchid, that matters because we enable you to pay for every packet routed through the network. So all of your data is protected, and you can pay in these micropayments, which is a hard thing to do on Ethereum, or was a hard thing to do before we created this probabilistic nanopayments functionality.
Yeah. And I think, go ahead, Ken. Sorry.
No, please.
Well, yeah, I'm actually kind of taking this in a different direction, but I was going to start talking about distributed services, which is a sort of the broader vision of what we're doing with the nanopayments platform. So if you think about Orchid as, and this is kind of one of the first times I'm talking about it, but if you think about Orchid as, we've got this decentralized VPN, which is you're paying nodes to encrypt and route your bandwidth, either from you to a website or you to another node that's doing the same thing, and then to a website or internet resource. And we're able to solve this payment scaling issue using these nanopayment frameworks. But in a larger sense, we also start to think about, well, what are the other kinds of services that those nodes or nodes running Orchid code could be running? And we've had a number of things we've been exploring. One idea, for example, would be, if you're familiar with what Brave is doing with Brave Attention Token, there could be a concept where a website that's got content will be accepting Orchid nanopayments and then unlocking paywalls and paying for content as you go. We've been looking at concepts around things like video streaming. We were talking about the Zoom idea, and CDNs and a number of other things. And in a broader context, I think that as we think about layer 1, layer 2, and combination just in general of decentralized smart contract platforms, we're very interested in the idea of a kind of like decentralized services. We've had, for the last year or so, we've had a big growth in decentralized finance. So we're interested in like what is the sort of decentralized services that enables new applications. And if you go back to the initial pitch for Ethereum, it was like, hey, we're building, a distributed computer. And I think guys like Dfinity have been saying the same kind of thing. In the end, these things don't really become distributed computers. They become sort of distributed databases that you then need to build applications on top of. We're now looking at a different layer where we're saying, well, what if we actually did build effectively a distributed computer, distributed services framework that you could do different things? That may not seem that obvious as to why you need them right away, but in the case of some of these trigger events, maybe a decentralized Zoom platform is the right thing to build.
The other thing that you're doing here is you're powering a new form of payment, right? Which is this continuous streaming payment. And when I think about the great outcomes from new technologies in the past, it's not because they take an existing big business and make it better that you get a big outcome. In fact, I can't think of a single big company before the internet that became a successful internet company. And maybe we could have a long argument about Apple, but short of that argument, there really isn't a big enterprise that existed before the internet that is now known as an internet company.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about what it is that builds these massive new companies, when you have something like the internet and now the blockchain, it's that these technologies enable something new. Streaming payments is something that's new. That we didn't have that capability before the blockchain, and there's at least 8 or 10 new things that the blockchain enables. That's one of them. We used to call it micropayments, but now as you start to see what a whole bunch of micropayments together is actually just streaming payments.
Yeah.
We'll see entirely new businesses and industries that get built as a result of that. Some that don't exist today because they can't exist without streaming payments. And then as a result of that, somebody's going to have some massive outcome because of that feature.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
That term streaming payments, I hadn't actually thought about it like that. That's really cool. I agree. It's definitely something that's, it's kind of blowing my mind just thinking about what the possibilities are when you think of it that way. It'll be interesting to see what kind of services we're able to build with that idea in mind.
I'm looking forward to seeing them.
Yeah. We'll be sure to share. So right now, going back to the current catalyst, right? We've got the Black Lives Matter movement, we've got COVID, and some of the things we've been seeing happening in the U.S., and globally. What are some of your biggest concerns right now for privacy and also human rights and democracy? We've talked a lot about privacy, but I think we've also seen in the U.S., I'm personally getting a little bit, very worried about our democracy. We had the elections in Georgia where, and this has happened in the past primaries there, where they had crazy long wait lines and the technology that they're using is just breaking. And, so there's just some things I'm concerned about, but what are you both worried about in that context right now?
There's no question voter suppression is an issue. It has been for a long time. We have designed our voting maps to suppress the vote. We've designed our polling places to suppress the vote. I think what you've got right now is almost a perfect storm. I think the closest parallel in recent history or in my lifetime is 9/11, because you had a financial crisis in 2000 followed by a terrorist, really a massive terrorist act that happened 16, 17 months, 18 months later that became a financial, almost a financial crisis wrapped in a terrorist event. And now you've got a pandemic that's wrapped in a financial crisis, that's wrapped in a very significant movement of social unrest. Um, the cause, probably the disparity in wealth. It's never been greater in human history. There is um, there is a common thread about revolution that takes place when there is a huge gap in wealth. We have that gap in wealth. We have what certainly feels like some form of revolution right now, and the world's not going to be the same. It will not be going back to what we had before this. Revolution leads to radical change, and we're going to see some radical change here, and it's going to be at every level. I think in some obvious ways, this has pulled the blockchain forward by several years. Whatever we thought it was going to take for the blockchain to emerge as a tool that governments and large enterprises use, I think that's going to, whatever we thought was going to be in 4 years is now going to be in 12 months. We're seeing that happen. I think Facebook and Libra also pulled it forward. I think the pandemic is pulling it forward. I think privacy is getting pulled forward by both the pandemic and the social unrest. The digital currencies and digital wallets are being pulled forward by none other than the U.S. government as a result of the financial crisis. So there's no going back to where we were. And the question is, how does this all unfold? The short answer for me is the supply chain got absolutely devastated. The unemployment on top of that is likely to lead to a spending environment, a consuming environment, and an income environment radically different than what the market is currently suggesting. We have unemployment levels right now that are greater than the first year of the Great Depression. And I don't see that getting better because we've spent trillions of dollars to keep people employed with government intervention. And when that money runs out, and some of it runs out in June and July, and when unemployment runs out for the people the 40 million who have been let go later this year, we could have a rebounding unemployment crisis. Not rebounding, but we could have a second unemployment crisis or a worsening unemployment crisis. And we may also be seeing the effects of a second wave of COVID this summer. So I guess I'm not terribly optimistic about the near term, but in the long term, I'm extremely optimistic because there is a rule that plays out, which is when digital goes against analog, digital wins every time. And we now have a new digital technology in the blockchain that is likely to make a lot of things different and improve a lot of outcomes and enable a lot of new very big businesses. So at least from an investing standpoint, I'm very optimistic. From a civilization standpoint, I'm very optimistic. I think there's going to be a lot of pain in the near term. Seven, what do you think?
I feel like I should give you the good news.
Please do.
That was my good news.
Heavy, man. Yeah. As a couple of weeks ago, well, I guess last week, I was in the mostly peaceful, I think 100% peaceful, 30,000 person protest in San Francisco, which actually didn't get very much attention because I guess there wasn't enough looting, rather cynically. The press tends to focus on that. And the next day, someone tweeted, "How come San Francisco hasn't had more violent protests? I thought they were the bastion of freedom in the past." And the conversation I started having with some friends was, what is the difference if you've got lockdown, as Ken was talking about, issues with voting, where you go back to the situation with Wisconsin, where there was this, the senator and the governor was trying to postpone the elections, and the legislature, which was largely Republican, pushed it through. in order just to have the election. And then you have curfews, and then technically, what is the difference between that and martial law? I mean, I know you have police on the streets, you have military on the streets, and so on. But you start ending up with these situations where it's almost like boiling a frog, right? You kind of get closer and closer to a situation which you wake up one day and you kind of take a look. It's like, well, I can't fly anywhere. No one can fly here. I can't go outside in the day or the night. I can't vote. What happened, right? And that's to me the scariest realization, because there is this kind of grinding out right now. We're in California right now, and we end up with really the most strangely most conservative approach to COVID. And I'll go a little bit controversial here, but we've changed the narrative over the last 3 months from let's lock down because we want to protect the healthcare systems to let's lock down so that no one ever gets infected. That's a very different conversation to have with a society. And if you do the second one, then you basically shut down your economy until you have a vaccine. And we're not quite sure when that's going to be, or if that's going to happen. So I think the next year or two is going to be tough, especially in this country, which has very much a cargo cult approach to the virus, which means that no state will ever really open up completely until all states have solved the virus problem, whether it's with vaccines or with other approaches, which is the sort of disadvantage of the open borders that we have in the United States. And Europe actually went with a different approach. Even though they have open borders, normally they close their borders to other countries in order to isolate things. And there's arguments pro and against whether you should have open borders or not in an epidemic. But I think that the positive thing through the sort of this process is that we are shining lights on not only civil unrest and the issues that seem to be pretty systemic in policing and racial inequality, but also on things like healthcare systems and the general inequality that exists there. Why are people getting $30,000-$40,000 bills for just getting tested for COVID? What is going on there? And I think that it's within both situations, we are faced with a choice as a society: are we a society that wants to care for its people? Do we want to provide opportunities for all people, and do we want to care for all people, or do we want it to be based on how much money you've got, or what color you were born, or where you were born? What kind of society is that? And I think it's a existential conversation, an existential choice that this country and other countries are facing right now,
and having right now for the first time.
Yeah.
There's certain things that have been shocking. I did not know until very recently that New York City's police department has tanks, as an example. That was shocking to me.
Where did you see that?
And I don't remember where I heard that somewhere. But I don't remember where I heard it. So we're seeing. I also had no concept of the scale of these police department budgets. And New York is $5.7 billion a year or something close to that. That's a lot of money. And given the systemic problems we have in New York City, and I saw yesterday that the LAPD budget is 54% of Los Angeles total metropolitan budget. I think there's a reason why LA has so much unrest and New York has so much unrest. And without seeing the numbers and without having this conversation brought down into our lives, because it's never been a part of my life, and it's been eye-opening.
Yeah,
I agree with that.
Just on that point, in terms of how the light shining has happened, like, all respect to what happened with George Floyd, and it was terrible, of course, but there could have been a temptation by many people to see that as, it's an isolated incident, and police aren't really like that, and this was just some bad actors. And then you have protests about police brutality, which expose more police brutality, and not just against people of color, but against elderly gentlemen in Buffalo, or young white girls in New York, and so on. And you see it happening in real time, because all of a sudden,
let's call it what it is. This is the light side of the loss of privacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is not the dark side. Like
right.
the fact that there are cameras out there capturing this has sparked this movement, because I think the scale at which this is happening is so much larger than most of us probably had ever conceived of. And as a result, without those cameras, without that loss of privacy, we probably wouldn't be aware of how
100%.
widespread this problem is.
Or what's even worse, it would be erased, right? It would just be erased from the memory of our society. And I think the Washington Post, I believe it was, I'll have to go look at it. It was either New York Times or Washington Post. They recreated, crowdsourced from all the social media videos, the live streams of the incident where Trump walked across to do that photo op, and they forced all of the U.S. citizens peacefully protesting. They violently forced them out of the area and injured many people. And they documented all of that. The video is really cool. They have the live streams, and then they have a map view that shows the direction that the person holding the camera is pointing, and it has some narration going on and a timeline and everything like that. The only reason they were able to put that together is because citizens were out there filming it with their, with their smartphone. You bring up really good points. There's definitely two sides of the coin with every technology, I feel.
Yeah, we're even going to see journalism change as a result of the blockchain, right? If you have a story to share, you can share it anonymously on a blockchain, but they can still reach back out to you to confirm parts. I think we might see a lot more sharing of information anonymously to newspapers. I think it's going to be much harder for people to hide things and get away with things as a result of the blockchain, for example, and the loss of that privacy.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's really important. I was listening to a podcast, Recode, today, and they had, I'll have to look it up. His name's Ben. Podcast. Hold on, it's right here. Bart Gelman, who is a journalist who broke the story about Snowden on, and he was talking about the process that they went through of building trust between one another. So they got connected through somebody else and started having some communication. And I'm sure that they did that in some secure way, but having technology like you just mentioned that allows journalists to communicate with sources securely is really important because the Snowden revelations would have never come out, and we would never have had that conversation, about basically how, honestly, listening to him talk about it, I was blown away, even though I already knew all this stuff, just hearing it again, how the government, the NSA, was just sweeping all of these data centers that were outside the country, just dragging a big dragnet, gathering all this information about us, and then using that in an investigation later on. And anyway,
it's a perfect example of the analog to digital world, because if you go back to the Watergate era, I don't remember what the signal was for I have a question or I have information, but I think Woodward or Bernstein was like moving a tree on his balcony or something along those lines to alert Deep Throat that they needed to talk, and vice versa. I think Deep Throat was writing in the delivered New York Times, and my memory could be bad on that, but we've come a long way from analog to digital in that regard. And I think the further we go, the more likely that loss of privacy is actually going to benefit society.
Yeah, I think I'd probably call it like, it's sort of the difference between transparency and privacy.
Yeah.
Right? It's like that we want our elected officials and people who are sworn in to protect us to be transparent in their actions. And often they're not. And so we now have more transparency around that. But at the same time, we want, as citizens, the right to be private when we choose to be private. And obviously there's lots of nuances there we can dive into on another call maybe. But
yeah. Yeah, we are. One thing I wanted to call out here too, and this is Orchid related. We do have a policy of any journalist who reaches out to us and needs access to Orchid, we give them access for free, just because of the point you brought up, Ken, because we want to make sure we support that and protect them and any sources that they might be communicating with. So we are at the top of the hour. I always end each episode this way, and it's okay if you don't know how to respond, but what have I not asked you that I should have asked? This is to both of you guys, and or what else do you want to tell anybody who's listening to this podcast right now?
Well, for me, I'd just like to end on an optimistic note, which I think I ruined every shot of earlier. There is, in my view, there is the likelihood that this recession is going to create, and this moment in time is going to create some of the greatest outcomes in history. Investment outcomes, creativity outcomes, employment outcomes, in a large part because the nature of competition changes in the midst of chaos and in the midst of a recession. Much less money goes to fund Me Too projects. It becomes possible to be more efficient with capital, to acquire customers more easily. There is a higher focus on building a great product, where the product speaks and goes viral as a result of that. And we've seen it in the past. We saw it in the 2000 recession where companies like Amazon and Google had time and space to grow without competition. We saw it in the 2008 recession where Facebook really took off and Airbnb and Uber had the chance to grow coming out of those recessions. It was not quick back to easy money. And without easy money, the competitive playing field really becomes cleaned out very quickly. And so I think many of the great companies that we're going to be talking about in 10 years are getting built right now and have become advantaged by this, I would say, very difficult financial environment.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Ken, and there's definitely a lot of historical analogs for that. And I think that with all the other factors, whether it's societal, healthcare related, and all these things, there's a lot of opportunities there. And we got very political here in the call, which is I think that if you're in crypto, you've got to think macro all the time, and it's sometimes kind of overwhelming to be really focused on what's happening in the world. I guess my positive note I would end on is that we are in a democracy, and this is in our hands to change. So get out and vote when you can.
100%. I love
Yep.
that. Well, thank you both for being on the show. I'm gonna hit stop here, but I really appreciate you guys taking the time.